Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well tonight. This evening we are going to be reading through chapter 51 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. If this is your first time watching, we're not just going to be reading the words. We're going to be stopping and talking about interesting vocabulary words that if you're learning English and you're a somewhat advanced learner, you probably still are not familiar with these words. Or sometimes we'll stop to talk about phrases, interesting phrases, or phrases that maybe you don't understand. Now we're doing it live. We're doing this video live. So if you're watching this live with me, and I hope you are, then please make questions in the comments. Ask me, what does that mean? I don't understand this. Explain this to me. That's what makes this unique and interesting, is that we can talk about the meanings of the phrases and the words as we go. So don't think you're interrupting me. I want you to ask many, many questions. All right, well, let's get started. We're getting very close to the end of the book. It took a long time to get here. This is a very long book. All right, so we have the beginning of a longer journey. It was yet early in the morning of the following day, when as I was walking in my garden with my aunt, who took a little other exercise now, being so much in attendance with my dear Dora, I was told that Mr. Peggotty desired to speak with me. He came into the garden to meet me halfway, and on my going towards the gate, he bared his head, as it was always his custom to do when he saw my aunt, for whom he had a high respect. Wait a minute. Have I already read this? This sounds so familiar. She walked up with a cordial face, shook hands with him, patted him on the arm, and it was so expressively done that she had no need to say a word. Mr. Peggotty understood her quite as well as if she had said 1,000. "I'll go in now, Trot," said my aunt, "and look after little Blossom, who will be getting up presently." "Not along of my being here, ma'am, I hope," said Mr. Peggotty. So he's saying, you're not going in because of me, are you? "Unless my wits is gone, a bad sneezing," by which Mr. Peggotty meant birds nesting this morning. "'Tis along of me as you're going to quit us." "You have something to say, my good friend," returned my aunt, "and will do better without me." "By your leave, ma'am," returned Mr. Peggotty, "I should take it kind, provising you don't mind my clicketin' if you'd bide here." Okay, well, so even, don't worry if you don't understand this. He's got a very interesting way of talking, an interesting way of using words, and he uses interesting words. So even in the book, they're explaining what he's talking about sometimes. I think he just said, "No, I prefer if you stay here." "Would you?" said my aunt, with a short good nature. "Then I'm sure I will." So she drew her arm through Mr. Peggotty's, and walked with him to a leafy little summer house there was at the bottom of the garden, where she sat down on a bench, and I beside her. There was a seat for Mr. Peggotty too, but he preferred to stand, leaning his hand on the small rustic table, as he stood looking at his cap for a little while before beginning to speak. I could not help observing what power and force of character his sinewy hand expressed. Sinewy. Let's look up that word. Sinewy. Consisting or resembling sinews. Well, that helps. Let's look up sinew meaning. A piece of tough, fibrous tissue, uniting bone muscle to bone or bone to bone, a tendon or ligament, a part of the structure of the system. Okay, how do they use it here? I could not help observing what power and force of character his sinewy hand expressed. So maybe his hand is very solid, like a stone. And what a good and trusty companion it was to his honest brow and iron gray hair. "I took my dear child away last night," Mr. Peggotty began, as he raised his eyes to ours, "to my lodging, where I have long time been expecting of her and preparing for her. It was hours afore she knowed me right. When she did, she kneeled down at my feet, and kinder said to me, as if it were prayers, how it all come to be. You may believe me when I heard her voice, as I had heard at home, so playful, and see her humbled, as it might be in the dust our Saviour wrote with his blessed hand. I felt a wound go to my art in the midst of all its thankfulness. A wound. I'm not sure what that word is supposed to be. He drew his sleeve across his face, without any pretense of concealing why, and then cleared his voice. So he's starting to cry. It weren't long as I felt that for she was found, I had only to think as she was found, and it was gone. I don't know why I do so much as mention of it now, I'm sure. I didn't have it in my mind a minute ago, to say a word about myself, but it come up so natural that I yield to it afore I was aweer. So he's saying, I don't care what she did, but I'm just happy that she's home. And then he's saying, I'm sorry that I'm talking about myself. It just happened. It's not about me. It's about her. You are a self-denying soul, said my aunt, and will have your reward. Mr. Peggotty, with the shadows of the leaves playing athwart his face, athwart. Well, these are not words that you have to know. Let's see, athwart, from side to side, across, in opposition, counter to. Okay. Mr. Peggotty, with the shadows of the leaves playing athwart his face, made a surprised inclination of his head towards my aunt. That means he went like this, as an acknowledgment of her good opinion, and then took up the thread he had relinquished. When my Emily took flight, he said in stern wrath for the moment, from the house where she was made a prisoner by that there spotted snake as Master Davy, see, and his story's true, and may God confound him, she took flight in the night. It was dark, so she escaped. She was sort of held a prisoner when she ran off to Italy, and she escaped in the middle of the night. It was a dark night, with many stars a-shining. She was wild. She ran along the sea beach, believing the old boat was there, and calling out to us to turn away our faces, for she was a-comin' by. To come by means like to come to somebody's home. You know, usually if you're inviting someone to your house, you don't say, come here or come to my home. You say, come by. That word by, B-Y, in combination with certain verbs, means come to my home or go to my home or something like this, pass to my home. Could mean like coming near, coming close, something like that. She heard herself a-crying out, like as if it was another person, and cut herself on them sharp-pinted stones and rocks, and felt it no more than if she had been a rock herself. So she escaped from her captivity, and she was running along the beach, thinking she was back home, looking for the home where she lived, looking for looking for Mr. Peggotty's home. She was delirious. Delirious is when you're so sick, you don't know what's happening, you don't know where you are or what you're doing. So she's looking for her family on that beach in Italy. Ever so fur she ran, and there was fire afore her eyes, and the roaring in her ears of sudden. Or so she thought, you understand. The day broke, wet and windy, and she was lying below a heap of stone upon a shore. So she heard noises and she saw lights, but she was just on the beach in the dark in Italy. And eventually she went to sleep. She passed out. But in the morning, a woman was a-speaking to her, saying, in the language of that country, what was it as had gone so much amiss? So there was a woman speaking in Italian. What's wrong? What's wrong with you? I don't know if she speaks Italian. I don't remember. He saw everything he related. It passed before him. As he spoke so vividly that in the intensity of his earnestness, he presented what he described to me with greater distinctness than I can express. I can hardly believe, writing now, long afterwards, but that I was actually present in these scenes. They are impressed upon me with such astonishing air of fidelity. As Emily's eyes, which was heavy, see this woman better, Mr. Peggotty went on. She knowed as she was one of them, and she had often talked to on the beach. So when Emily was still having her affair with Steerforth, she always liked to go and visit the beach because her whole family was fishermen, and Mr. Peggotty's a fisherman. And so she feels a deep connection with the people who live on the beach and who are also make their living by fishing. And so she made friends with these people when everything was still okay, because she liked to go and say, oh, you know, I'm from a fishing family too. I'm just like you. So she recognized this woman as one of those people that she would sometimes talk to. For though she had run, as I've said, ever so fur in the night, she had oftentimes wandered long ways, partly afoot, partly in boats and carriages, and knowed all that country, long the coast, miles and miles. She hadn't no children of her own, this woman, being a young wife, but she was a-looking to have one afore long, and may my prayers go up to heaven that 'twill be a happiness to her, and a comfort, and an honor all her life. May it love her and be dutiful to her in her old age, helpful of her at the last, a angel to hear and hereafter. So he's saying, I guess this woman rescued Emily because he's giving her all these blessings. I hope she has a wonderful family and she's very happy with them for the rest of her life. So I guess she must have done something wonderful for Emily. She had been somewhat timorous and down. Somewhat, I think that's somewhat. She had been somewhat means a little. Timorous and down. I don't know what timorous means. I don't think that's a real word, but I'll just check anyway. It is a real word, showing or suffering of nervousness, fear or a lack of confidence, said Mr. Peggotty, and had sat at first a little way off at her spinning or such work as it was, when Emily talked to the children. But Emily had took notice of her, and had gone and spoke to her. And as the young woman was partial to the children herself, to be partial to something means you prefer it. Would you like pizza or sushi? I'm partial to pizza. That means I prefer pizza. That's my preference. It's pretty formal to use that, I think, in contemporary English, but it's still something that people do sometimes. The young woman was partial to the children herself, so that meant that she preferred to be around the young children as she worked. And they had soon made friends. Sir, much sir. That's Mr. Peggotty speak for so much, sir. That when Emily went that way, she always give Emily flowers. This was her as now asked what it was that had gone so much amiss. When something is amiss, that means something isn't right. Something is wrong. So if you say, what's amiss? That means, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? What's your problem? Not so common in contemporary English. I think in older, in previous eras, you might say something is amiss, and that means, oh, we have a problem. But I think in contemporary English, you would just say, we have a problem. You might still hear it sometimes, though. It's not extremely weird. It's just a little bit rare now. Emily told her, and she took her home. She did indeed. She took her home, said Mr. Peggotty, covering his face. He was more affected by this act of kindness than I had ever seen him affected by anything since the night when she went away. My aunt and I did not attempt to disturb him. It was a little cottage, you may suppose, he said presently, but she found space for Emily in it. Her husband was away at sea, and she kept it secret, and prevailed upon such neighbors as she had. To prevail upon someone is to, press them for favors. As she had, there was not many near to keep it secret too. So she asked the neighbors not to mention the girl to anyone. Emily was took bad with fever, and what is very strange to me is, maybe 'tis not so strange to scholars, the language of that country went out of her head, and she could only speak her own. That no one understood, she recollects, as if she had dreamed it, and she lay there always a-talk in her own tongue, always believing as the old boat was round the next pint in the bay, and begging, imploring of him to send her there to tell how she was dying, and bring back a message of forgiveness. If it was only a word, a'most the whole time, she thought. So I remember in a previous chapter, Emily turns out to be very talented at learning languages. So as she was traveling throughout Europe with Steerforth, she would very easily pick up the local languages like French or German. And she was in Italy. And I because they mentioned other languages, I couldn't remember if it was said that she could speak Italian, but I guess she was very good at it. But because of this traumatic incident that happened to her, she forgot how to speak Italian, or she forgot she was in Italy. Like I said, she was delirious. Delirious means not knowing where you are or what's happening around you. So she's in this fisherwoman's bed in her home, but she's only talking in English. And she thinks that she's at home, and she's begging them, please, please take me to my uncle. And they have no idea what she's talking about. All right. Now, that him as I made mention on just how was lurking for her underneath the winder, now that him as had brought her to this was in the room, and cried to the good young woman not to give her up, and knowed at the same time that she couldn't understand, and dreaded that she must be took away. Okay, now I'm a little bit confused. Because Mr. Peggotty is saying, now, this guy I was talking about earlier, but I don't know which guy he's referring to. But he's talking about someone who was hiding near the window and brought her to this was in the room. Steerforth? It's either Steerforth or the servant, I guess, and cried to the good young woman not to give her up, and knowed at the same time that she couldn't understand, and dreaded that she must be took away. Likewise, okay, I'm a little bit confused, but I'm not really sure what he's saying there. But he's talking about somebody who's hiding there. I don't know. Well, maybe we'll figure it out as we get further on. Likewise, the fire was afore her eyes, and the roarings in her ears, and there was no today, no yesterday, nor yet tomorrow, but everything in her life as ever had been, or ever could be, and everything as never had been and never could be, was crowding on her all at once, and nothing clear nor welcome. Oh, maybe she was hallucinating that people were there to take her, and she was saying, please don't let them take me. But they can't understand what she's saying because she's speaking in English. How long this lasted, I don't know. But then there come a sleep, and in that sleep, from being a many times stronger than her own self, she fell into the weakness of the littlest child. Here he stopped, as if for relief from the terrors of his own description. After being silent for a few moments, he pursued his story. It was a very pleasant afternoon when she awoke, and so quiet, and there weren't a sound but the rippling of the blue sea without a tide upon a shore. It was her belief at first that she was at home upon a Sunday morning, but the vine leaves, as she see at the winder, and the hills beyond, weren't home, and contradicted of her. Then come in her friend to watch alongside her bed, and then she knowed as the cold boat weren't round the next pint in the bay no more, but she was fur off, and knowed where she was and why, and broke out crying on that good young woman's bosom, where I hope her baby is a lying now, a cheering of her with its pretty eyes. So eventually Emily went to sleep for a very long time. And when she awoke, she thought she was home, but she was more in reality now. She was just confused. So she woke up and she said, oh, I'm at home. But then she looked around and she saw, oh, this is not home, because I can see mountains in the distance and some flowers that shouldn't be there. And then the woman who saved her came in, and she realized where she really was, really far from home, and she remembered all the things that happened, and she started crying. He could not speak of this good friend of Emily's without a flow of tears. It was in vain to try. He broke down again, endeavoring to bless her. That done my Emily good, he resumed, after such emotion, as I could not behold without sharing in. And as to my aunt, she wept with all her heart. That done Emily good, and she begun to mend. Mending, you always talk, mending means fix, and it's especially true of fixing clothes, like sewing. You mend your pants, you mend your socks. It really means fix. So when he says Emily began to mend, it means she began to feel better. She was becoming healthier. But the language of that country was quite gone from her, and she was forced to make signs. So she went on, getting better day to day, slow but sure, and trying to learn the names of common things, names as she seemed never to have heard in all her life, till one evening come, when she was a-settin' at her window, looking at a little girl at play upon the beach. And of a sudden this child held out her hand, and said, what would be in English, fisherman's daughter, here's a shell. For you are to understand, they used at first to call her pretty lady, as the general way in that country, and she had taught him to call her fisherman's daughter instead. The child says of a sudden, "Fisherman's daughter, here's a shell," and then Emily understands her, and she answers, bursting out crying, and it all comes back. When Emily got strong again, said Mr. Peggotty, after another short interval of silence, she cast about to leave that good young creature and get to her own country. The husband was come home then, and the two together put her aboard a small trader bound to Leghorn, and from that to France. She had a little money, but it was less than a little, and they would take for all they done, as they would take for all they done. Let me read that again. She had a little money, but it was less than little, as they would take for all they done. And I'm almost glad on it, though they was so poor. What they done is laid up where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. Master Davy, it'll outlast all the treasures of the world. I'm confused. Did they accept? I think they didn't accept money. So she had a little bit of money and she tried to offer them some of it, but they refused. I think that's what he's saying. Emily got to France and took service to wait on traveling ladies at an inn in the port. There come one day that snake. Let him never come nigh me again. I don't know what hurt I might do him. Some as these see him. Soon as she see him, without him seeing her, all her fear and wildness returned upon her, and she fled afore the very breath he drawed, and she come to England, and was set ashore at Dover. Okay, I'm sorry, I have to take a 1-minute break. I will be back in 1 minute. All right, thank you for waiting. Sorry about that. Let's keep going. I shouldn't be drinking more coffee. That's just getting me in trouble. I don't know, said Mr. Peggotty, for sure when her art begun to fail her, but all the way to England she had thought to come to her dear home. Soon as she got to England, she turned her face towards it. But fear of not being forgive, fear of being pinted at, fear of us being dead along of her, fear of many things, turned her from it, kinder by force upon the road. Uncle, uncle, she says to me, the fear of not being worthy to do what my torn and bleeding breast so longed to do was the most frightening fear of all. I turned back when my heart was full of prayers that I might crawl to the old doorstep in the night, kiss it, lay my wicked face upon it, and there be found dead in the morning. So when Emily, all through the boat trip from France to England, she was thinking, I'm going home, I'm going home. But when, it's funny because this morning we were reading Gone with the Wind, and it wasn't in the book, but I used it because it's convenient. To be a chicken is, it's a way of saying that somebody is afraid. So when you say you're a chicken, that means you're afraid of something. And there's a phrasal verb, to chicken out, means, first you have courage and you say I'm going to do it, but then when the time comes to actually do it, you can't. You're too afraid. So you don't do it, and that's chickening out. So all through the boat ride from France to England, she was thinking, oh, I'm going home. But then once she arrived in England, she chickened out. She said, oh, I can't go home. They probably hate me now. I could never go home. And she just came up with this fantasy of getting to the home and then lying at the doorstep and dropping dead. She comes, said Mr. Peggotty, dropping his voice to an awe-stricken whisper, to London. She, as had never seen in her life alone, without a penny, young, so pretty, come to London. A'most the moment that she lighted here, all so desolate she found, and she believed a friend, a decent woman, as spoke to her about the needlework, as she had been brought up to do, about finding plenty of it for her, about the lodging for the night, and making secret inquiration concerning of me and all at home tomorrow. When my child, he said aloud, with an energy of gratitude that shook from him head to foot, stood upon the brink, more than I can say or think on, Martha, true to her promise, saved her. I could not repress a cry of joy. Master Davy, said he, gripping my hand in that strong hand of his. It was you at first made mention of her to me. I thank ye, sir. She was earnest. She had note of her bitter knowledge, where to watch and what to do. She had done it, and the Lord was above all. She come, white and hurried upon Emily in her sleep. She says to her, rise up from your worse than death, and come with me. Them belonging to the house would have stopped her, but they might as soon have stopped the sea. Stand away from me, she says. I'm a ghost that calls her from beside her open grave. She told Emily she had seen me, and knowed I loved her, and forgive her, and she wrapped her hasty in her clothes. She took her faint and trembling in her arms, and she heeded her no more what they said. Then if she had had no heirs, she walked among them with my child, minding only her, and brought her safe out in the dead of night from that black pit of ruin. So I think some woman found Emily penniless and very pretty and tried to make her into a prostitute. I think that's what he's saying. But she gave her a place to stay. But Martha, being from the streets, knows exactly where to look for her, and she found her immediately and took her away from that place. And normally that would be almost impossible because these are criminals and violent people. But Martha protected her. She attended on Emily, said Mr. Peggotty, who had released my hand, and put his own hand on his heaving chest. Heaving is when, if you're breathing heavy, heaving means pulling something heavy. But heaving, when you're talking about breathing, it's like visual breathing. Maybe because you're breathing very heavy. She attended to my Emily, lying wearied out and wandering betwixt whiles, till late the next day, and then she went into search of me, and then in search of you, Master Davy. She didn't tell Emily what she come out for, lest her art should fail, and she should think of hiding of herself. How the cruel lady knowed of her being there, I can't say. Whether him as I have spoke so much of chanced to see him going there, or whether, which is most like to my thinking, she had heard it from the woman, I don't greatly ask myself. My niece is found. All night long, said Mr. Peggotty, we have been together, Emily and me. 'Tis little, considering the time, as she had said in words, through them broken-hearted tears. 'Tis less as I have seen of her dear face, as growed into a woman's at my own hearth. But all night long her arms has been about my neck, and her head has laid here. And we knows full well as we can put our trust in one another evermore. He ceased to speak, and his hand upon the table rested there in perfect repose, with a resolution in it that might have conquered lions. It was a gleam of light upon me, Trot, said my aunt, drying her eyes, when I formed the resolution of being godmother to your sister Betsy Trotwood, who disappointed me. But, next to that, hardly anything would have given me greater pleasure than to be godmother to that good young creature's baby. Mr. Peggotty nodded his understanding of my aunt's feelings, but could not trust himself with any verbal reference to the subject of her commendation. We all remained silent and occupied with our own reflections, my aunt drying her eyes, and now sobbing convulsively, and now laughing and calling herself a fool, until I spoke. You have quite made up your mind, said I to Mr. Peggotty, as to the future, good friend? I need scarcely ask you. Quite, Master Davy, he returned, and told Emily there's mighty countries far from here. Our future life lays over sea. They will emigrate together, aunt, said I. Yes, said Mr. Peggotty, with a hopeful smile. No one can reproach my darling in Australia. We will begin a new life over there. So they're emigrating to Australia. I asked him if he yet proposed to himself any time for going away. I was down at the docks early this morning, sir, he returned, to get information concerning of them ships. In about 6 weeks or 2 months from now there'll be one sailing. I see her this morning, went aboard, and we shall take our passage in her. Quite alone? I asked. Aye, Master Davy, he returned. My sister, you see, she's that fond of you and yourn, that accustomed to think of only of her own country, that it wouldn't be hardly fair to let her go. Besides which, there's one thing she has in charge, Master Davy. It don't ought to be forgot. Poor Ham, said I. So, Peggotty's saying, yes, we're going off to Australia, and Davy says, you're going alone? And Mr. Peggotty understands, is Peggotty going with you, your sister? And he says, no, because she loves you so much, she can't possibly leave here. But also there's another reason, Ham. And that was, Emily was supposed to marry Ham, but instead she ran off with Steerforth to Europe, and that's how she got in all this trouble. Poor Ham, said I. My good sister takes care of his house, you see, ma'am, and he takes kindly to her, Mr. Peggotty explained for my aunt's better information. He'll sit and talk to her with a calm spirit when it's like he couldn't bring himself to open his lips to another, poor fellow, said Mr. Peggotty, shaking his head. There's not so much left him that he could spare a little as he has. So, Mrs. Peggotty is also staying to take care of Ham, and she takes care of his house. She cleans his house, and she's the only person that he feels comfortable around because his heart is broken. But for some reason, Peggotty makes him feel okay. So he needs her. "And Mrs. Gummidge," said I. "Well, I've got a mort of consideration, I do tell you," returned Mr. Peggotty with a perplexed look which gradually cleared as he went on. "Concerning of Mrs. Gummidge, you see, when Mrs. Gummidge falls a-thinking of the old un, she ain't what you may call good company betwixt you and me, Master Davy, and you, ma'am, when Mrs. Gummidge takes on wimicking, our old country word for crying. So Mrs. Gummidge is perpetually, that means always, perpetually depressed. Her husband died, and ever since then she's just been a very sad, broken-hearted woman. And Mr. Peggotty takes care of her. She lives there, and he feeds her and takes care of her. But she's not a very pleasant person to be around. She's always very sad and crying. And Davy says, well, what will you do with Mrs. Gummidge? And he says, well, it's not very easy to be around her. But what did he say, though? He didn't give an answer yet. Let's see. She's liable to be considered to be by them as didn't know the old un peevish like. Now I did know the old un, said Mr. Peggotty, and I know his merits, so I understand her. But 'tain't entirely so, you see, with others, naturally can't be. So Mr. Peggotty is afraid if he takes Mrs. Gummidge with her, people will hate her in Australia because they don't know her life and her history and why she is the way that she is. My aunt and I both acquiesced, whereby, said Mr. Peggotty, my sister might, I don't say she would, but she might find Mrs. Gummidge give her a little trouble now and again. Therefore, 'tain't my intentions to moor Mrs. Gummidge long with them, but to find a bein for her where she can fisherate herself. A bein, see, this is very hard to understand what he's saying because he doesn't speak standard English. So even here they're explaining a little bit of what he's talking about. A bein signifies in that dialect a home, and to officiate is to provide. So let's see. Let's go back. Find a bein for her where she can fisherate for herself. So they want to find a home for her before they leave, where she could be comfortable. For which purpose, said Mr. Peggotty, I means to make her allowance for I go. So Mr. Peggotty is actually going to set up some kind of bank account or fund where she will be paid a little bit of money every month, so she won't be homeless or hungry. As I'll leave her pretty comfortable. She's the faithfulest of creatures. 'Tain't to be expected, of course, at her time of life, and being lone and lorn, as the good old mother is to be knocked about aboard ship, and in the woods and wilds of a new and far-away country, so that's what I'm going to do. He's also saying, she's so old, she can't handle this very long boat trip. And then when we arrive in Australia, it's a wild place, and it won't be good for an old woman to live in that environment. He forgot nobody. He thought of everybody's claims and strivings but his own. So all he's doing is thinking about how am I going to take care of all of these people, but he never thinks about himself. Emily, he continued, will keep along with me. Poor child, she's sore in need of peace and rest. Until such time as we goes upon our voyage, she'll work at them clothes, as must be made, and I hope her troubles will begin to seem longer ago than they was, when she finds herself once more by her rough but loving uncle. My aunt nodded in confirmation of this hope and imparted great satisfaction to Mr. Peggotty. "There's one thing further, Master Davy," said he, putting his hand in his breast pocket and gravely taking out the little paper bundle I had seen before, which he unrolled on the table. "There's these here banknotes, £50 and 10. To them I wish to add to the money as she came away with. I asked her about that, but not saying why, and have added it up. I ain't a scholar. Would you be so kind to see how it is?" So, well, I'm not sure what that money was for. These banknotes, she came away. So when she ran away, she had a certain amount of money. To them I wish to add the money as she come away with. I'm not sure if come away with means maybe she took from Steerforth. Well, Emily has £50 for some reason. Let's just say that. And Mr. Peggotty is concerned. I don't really understand what he's saying. But Mr. Peggotty is concerned about these 50 banknotes. But he was asking her, how much money did you spend? And he tried to add it up. But he's saying, I'm not really good at math. Can you please verify this? Maybe we'll see more about that in a minute. He handed me, apologetically for his scholarship, a piece of paper, and observed me while I looked it over. It was quite right. "Thank ye, sir," he said, taking it back. "This money, if you don't see objections, Master Davy, I shall put up just afore I go," and a cover directed to him. Yeah, so this is money, like maybe this is the amount of money that Steerforth spent on Emily at some point. And Mr. Peggotty wants to make sure that he returns it to him so that there's no idea that they owe him anything. "And put that up in another directed to his mother. I shall tell her no more words than I speak to you. What it's the price on, and that I'm gone and past receiving it back." So he's going to send it to Steerforth and his mother and say, this is the money that he spent on Emily while they were on their little adventure. And it's too late to send it back because I'm going to Australia. I told him I thought it would be right to do so, that I was thoroughly convinced it would be, since he felt it to be right. I said to that there was only one thing further, he proceeded with a grave smile, when he had made up his little bundle again and put it in his pocket. But there was two. I weren't sure in my mind when I come out this morning as I could go and break to Ham of my own self that we had so thankfully happened. So I writ a letter while I was out and put it in the post office, telling him of how all was and 'tis, and that I should come down tomorrow to unload my mind of what little needs a doing down there, and most like take my farewell leave of Yarmouth. "And do you wish me to go with you?" said I, seeing that he left something unsaid. "If you could do me that favor, Master Davy," he replied. "I know the sight on you would cheer him up a bit." So I think, like I said, it's kind of hard to understand what he's saying, but I think he's saying, now I have to tell Ham everything that's happened, that Emily is back and that we're going to Australia. I'm going to do that tomorrow. And Davy's saying, "Do you want me to come with you?" And he's saying, "I think it would be better if you did, because he's very sensitive and he seems to be better around you." My little Dora being in good spirits and very desirous that I should go, as I found on talking it over with her, I readily pledged myself to accompany him, in accordance with his wish. Next morning, consequently, we were on the Yarmouth coach, and again traveling over the old ground. As we passed along the familiar street at night, Mr. Peggotty, in spite of all of my remonstrances, carrying my bag, I glanced into Omer and Joram's shop, and saw my old friend Mr. Omer there, smoking his pipe, I felt reluctant to be present when Mr. Peggotty first met his sister and Ham, and made Mr. Omer my excuse for lingering behind. "How is Mr. Omer?" "After this long time," said I, going in. So, as they arrive in Yarmouth, they're passing, what was the name of the shop? What an Omer? Omer and Joram's shop. Davy looks in and thinks, oh, there they are. But he doesn't want to say hello or anything like that. He's just feeling nostalgic. But Mr. Peggotty suggests, well, why don't you go in and say hello, and then I'll go to my sister's house, and you come a little bit later. And so Davy's like, yeah, okay, I guess I'll go see him. He didn't really want to. He fanned away the smoke of his pipe, that he might get a better view of me, and soon recognized me with great delight. "I should get up, sir, to acknowledge such an honor as this visit," said he, "only my limbs are rather out of sorts." Your limbs are like your arms and your legs. Those are your limbs. So when you say that something is out of sorts, it means they're not feeling well. So when he says my limbs are out of sorts, my arms and legs are not in good condition, so I can't stand up. "And my breath is, howsoever I am as hearty a man can be, I am thankful to say." I congratulated him on his contented looks and his good spirits, and saw now that his easy chair went on wheels. So now he's in a wheelchair. "It's an ingenious thing, ain't it?" he inquired, following the direction of my glance and polishing the elbow with his arm. "It runs as light as a feather and tracks as true as a mail coach. Bless you, my little Minnie, my granddaughter. You know Minnie's child. Put her little strength against the back, gives it a shove, and away we go, as clever and merry as ever you see anything." So he has fun with his granddaughter. He's in his wheelchair, and his granddaughter likes to push him really fast, and they have fun. "And I tell you what, it's a most uncommon chair to smoke a pipe in. I never saw such a good old fellow to make the best of a thing and find out the enjoyment of it as Mr. Omer. He was as radiant as if his chair, his asthma, and his failure of limbs were the various branches of a great invention for enhancing the luxury of a pipe." "I see more of the world, I can assure you," said Mr. Omer, "in this chair than I ever see out of it. You'd be surprised at the number of people that looks in of a day to have a chat. You really would. There's twice as much in the newspaper since I've taken to this chair than there used to be. As to general reading, dear me, what a lot of it I do get through. That's what I feel so strong, you know. If it had been my eyes, what should I have done? If it had been my ears, what should I have done? Being my limbs, what does it signify? Why, my limbs only made my breath shorter when I used them." He's really fat and he smokes a lot. So he's saying, my legs only used to give me problems. They made me... Now I don't do that anymore because I'm in my wheelchair. "And now, if I want to go out into the street or down the sands, I've only got to call Dick, Joram's youngest prentice, and away I go, in my own carriage, like the Lord Mayor of London." He half suffocated himself with laughing here. "Lord bless you," said Mr. Omer, resuming his pipe, "a man must take the fat with the lean. That's what he must make of his mind to do. In this life, Joram does a fine business, excellent business." "I'm very glad to hear it," said I. "I knew you would be," said Mr. Omer, "and Joram and Minnie are like valentines. What more can a man expect? What's his limbs to that?" His supreme contempt for his own limbs as he sat smoking was one of the pleasantest oddities I have ever countered, and since I took to general reading, You've took to general writing, eh, sir? Said Mr. Omer, surveying me admiringly. So he's saying, now I read a lot and I see you've become a writer. And he was very happy about that. What a lovely work that was of yours. What expressions in it. I read it every word. And as to feeling sleepy, not at all. I laughingly expressed my satisfaction, but I must confess that I thought this association of ideas significant. I give you my word of honor, sir, said Mr. Omer, that when I lay that book upon the table and look at it outside, compact in 3 separate individual volumes, 1, 2, 3, I am as proud as Punch to think that I once had the honor of being connected with your family. And dear me, it's a long time ago now, ain't it? Over at Blunderstone, with a pretty little party laid along with the other party, and you quite small party then, yourself, dear sir. Well, this is a bit cryptic and macabre, because this business that they own, I keep forgetting their words, Omer and Joram, I think, something like that, is an undertaker. The business of an undertaker is to take care of a dead body. When someone dies, you send it to the undertaker, and the undertaker will make it look nice, and then will put nice clothes on it, and make a box, which is called a coffin or a casket, to put it in the ground. And they also will do the ceremony of bringing the dead body to the place where they will put it in the ground. And that's the reason why Davy knows him, because when he was a little boy and his mother died, he was staying with Peggotty in Yarmouth, and before he could go back home, he had to sit there all day and wait as they made the box to put his mother in, and as they made the clothes that she would be buried in. So that's how they met, and that's what he's saying that, wait, let's read that again, now that I've reminded you of this. Over at Blunderstone, that's where Davy's mother lived and where she was buried. With a pretty little party laid along the other party, Davy's mother died, and his little brother also died at the same. His little baby brother died together. So that's what that means. The party means person here. So that's like saying with that pretty little person laid along that other person, and you quite small party then, you quite a small person then, yourself. Dear, dear. So he was a little boy. I changed the subject by referring to Emily, after assuring him that I did not forget how interested he had always been in her, and how kindly he had always treated her, and I gave him a general account of her restoration to her uncle by the aid of Martha, which I knew would please the old man. He listened with the utmost attention, and said feelingly when I had done, I am rejoiced at it, sir. It's the best news I've heard for many a day. Dear, dear, dear. And what's going to be undertook from that unfortunate young woman, Martha, now? You touch a point. So he's thinking, what happens to Martha now? And Davy says, you touch a point that my thoughts have been dwelling on since yesterday. So that's Davy saying, I've been thinking about that. What should happen to her? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm drinking too much coffee. I have to take another 1-minute break. I'll be right back. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, let's continue. So, what's going to happen with Martha? You touch a point that my thoughts have been dwelling on since yesterday, said I, but on which I can give you no information yet, Mr. Omer. Mr. Peggotty has not alluded to it. That means like he hasn't referred to it. And I have a delicacy in doing so. I'm sure he has not forgotten it. He forgets nothing that is disinterested and good. Because you know, said Mr. Omer, taking himself up where he had left off, whatever is done, I should wish to be a member of. Put me down for anything you consider right, and let me know. I never could think the girl all bad, and I'm glad to find she's not. So will my daughter Minnie be. Young women are contradictory creatures in some things. Her mother was just the same as her. But their hearts are soft and kind. It's all show with Minnie about Martha. Why she should consider it necessary to make any show, I don't undertake to tell you. But it's all show, bless you. She'd do her any kindness in private. So, I keep forgetting his name, Mr. Omer is saying, well, if you want to do something nice for her, give her money or something like that, let me know. I want to contribute to that, because even though she did a bad thing, I've always thought that really deep inside that she's a good person, and I want to help her. And I know that my daughter Minnie, even though in public she pretends to hate her and says horrible things about her, I know that my daughter also thinks very highly of her in private. So put me down. When you say put me down here, that means like write me down. Like if you're making a list of people who can contribute to helping her, put me on that list. Write me down. Write my name on that list. Put me down. That's a very common way of saying add me to the list. That put me down. That's actually pretty. I didn't even notice that the first time we were reading it. Okay, so put me down for whatever you may consider right. Will you be so good? And drop me a line where to forward it. Dear me, said Mr. Omer, when a man is drawing on to a time of life where the two ends of life meet, when he finds himself, however hardy he is, being wheeled about for the second time in a speeches of go-kart, he could be overrejoiced to do a kindness if he can. He wants plenty. And I don't speak of myself particular, said Mr. Omer, because, sir, the way I look at it, that we are all drawing onto the bottom of the hill, whatever age we are, on account of time, never standing still a single moment. So let us always do a kindness and be rejoiced, to be sure. He knocked the ashes out of his pipe and put it on the ledge in the back of his chair, expressly made for this purpose, for its reception. There's Emily's cousin, him that she was to have been married to, says Mr. Omer, rubbing his hands feebly. As fine a fellow as there is in Yarmouth. He'll come and talk or read to me in the evening for an hour together sometimes. That's a kindness, I should call it. All his life's a kindness. I'm going to see him tomorrow, said I. Are you? Said Mr. Omer. Tell him I was hearty, and sent my respects. Minnie and Joram's at a ball. They would be as proud to see you as I am, if they was at home. Minnie won't hardly go out at all, you see, on account of father, as she says. So I swore tonight that if she didn't go, I'd go to bed at 6, in consequence of which Mr. Omer shook himself and his chair with laughter at the success of his device, she and Joram's at the ball. So his daughter refuses to go out and have any fun because she feels like she has to take care of her father. So, but he feels bad about that. He doesn't like that. He wants her to go out and have fun. So he said, if you don't go to that party tonight, I'm going to stay up until 6 o'clock in the morning. That means she has to also. So she said, okay, fine, I'll go. I shook hands with him and wished him a good night. "Half a minute, sir," said Mr. Omer. "If you was to go without seeing my little elephant, you'd lose the best of sights. You've never seen such a sight. Minnie?" A musical voice answered from somewhere upstairs. "I'm coming, grandfather," and a pretty little girl with long flaxen curled hair soon came running into the shop. "This is my little elephant, sir," said Mr. Omer, fondling the child. Fondling means like squeezing, like something like this. This is fondling. "Siamese breed, sir. Now, little elephant." The little elephant set the door of the parlor open, enabling me to see that in these latter days it was converted into a bedroom for Mr. Omer, who could not be easily conveyed upstairs, and then hid her pretty forehead on and tumbled her long hair against the back of Mr. Omer's chair. The elephant butts, you know, sir. Butting means hitting. So especially if you're doing that with your head. So an animal maybe hits something with its head, that would be butting. "The elephant butts, you know, sir," said Mr. Omer, winking. "When he goes at an object, once, elephant, twice, 3 times. At this signal, the little elephant, with a dexterity that was next to marvelous, and so small an animal, whisked the chair round with Mr. Omer in it, and rattled it off pell-mell into the parlor." Without touching the doorpost, Mr. Omer, indescribably enjoying the performance and looking back at me on the road as if it were a triumphant issue of his life's exertions, after a stroll about town. I went to Ham's house. Peggotty had now removed here for good, and let her own house to the successor of Mr. Barkis in the carrying business. So now Peggotty is living with Ham, and she rents the house to the person who took over Mr. Barkis's business, who paid her very well for the goodwill, the cart, and the horse. I believe the very same slow horse that Mr. Barkis drove was still at work. I found them in the neat kitchen, accompanied by Mrs. Gummidge, who had been fetched from the old boat by Mr. Peggotty himself. I doubt if she could have been induced to desert her post by anyone else. He had evidently told them all, both Peggotty and Mrs. Gummidge had their aprons to their eyes, and Ham just stepped out to take a turn on the beach. Taking a turn means going for a walk. He presently came home, very glad to see me, and I hope they were all better for my being there. We spoke with some approach to cheerfulness of Mr. Peggotty's growing rich in a new country, and of the wonders he would describe in his letters. We said nothing of Emily by name, but distantly referred to her more than once. Ham was the serenest of the party. Serene means calm. But Peggotty told me, when she lighted me to the little chamber where the crocodile book was laying ready for me on the table, as he always was the same, she told me crying that he was broken-hearted, though he was as full of courage as of the sweetness, and worked harder and better than any boat builder and any yard in all that part. There were times, she said, of an evening, when he talked of their old life in the boathouse, and then he mentioned Emily as a child, but he never mentioned her as a woman. I thought I had read in his face that he would like to speak to me alone. I therefore resolved to put myself in his way the next evening, as he came home from his work. Having settled with myself, I fell asleep that night. For the first time in all those many nights, the candle was taken out of the window. Mr. Peggotty swung his old hammock in the old boat, and the wind murmured in the old sound round his head. All next day he was occupied with disposing of his fishing boat and tackle, and packing up, and sending to London by wagon such of his little domestic possessions as he thought would be useful to him. And in parting with the rest, or bestowing means giving, or bestowing them on Mrs. Gummidge, she was with him all day, as I had a sorrowful wish to see the old place once more before it was locked up. I engaged to meet them there in the evening. But I so arranged it as that I should meet him first. It was easy to come in his way, as I knew where he worked. I met him at a retired part of the sands, which I knew he would cross, and turned back with him, as he might have leisure to speak to me, if he really wished. I had not mistaken the expression of his face. We had walked but a little way together when he said, without looking at me, "Master Davy, have you seen her?" "Only for a moment, when she was in a swoon," I softly answered. We walked a little further, and he said, "Master Davy, shall you see her, do you think?" "It would be too painful to her, perhaps," said I. "I have thought of that." I'm sorry, I'm just rereading the lines to make sure I read them properly. I'm a little bit confused. Okay. "I have thought of that," he replied. "So 'twould, sir, so 'twould." "But, Ham," said I gently, "if there's anything that I could write to her for you, in case I could not tell it, if there's anything you would wish to make known to her through me, I should consider it a sacred trust." "I'm sure on't. I thank ye, sir, most kind. I think there is something I could wish said or wrote. I'm not sure what that on't. I'm sure, maybe I'm sure on it. I'm sure in it. I'm sure on it. I thank ye, sir, most kind. I think there is something I could wish said or wrote." "What is it?" We walked a little further in silence, and then he spoke. "'Tain't that I forgive her. 'Tain't that so much. It isn't that I forgive her. It isn't that so much. 'Tis more as I beg for her to forgive me. So it's more that I want her to forgive me for my having pressed my affections upon her. Odd times I think that if I hadn't had her promise for to marry me, sir, she was that trustful of me, in a friendly way, that she'd have told me what was struggling in her mind, and could have consoled me with me, and I might have saved her." So he's saying if I hadn't pressed my love on her, maybe she would have had time to tell me what was bothering her, and I could have helped her instead of her getting involved in all of this mess. We walked on farther than we had walked yet before he spoke again. He was not crying when he made these pauses, I shall express by lines, but he was merely collecting himself to speak very plainly. "I loved her, and I loved the memory of her too deep to be able to lead her to believe of my own self as I'm a happy man. I could only be happy by forgetting of her, and I'm afeard I could hardly bear as she could be told I done that. But if you, being so full of learning, Master Davy, could think of anything to say as might bring her to believe I wasn't greatly hurt, still loving of her, and mourning for her, anything as might bring her to believe as I was not tired of my life, and yet was hoping for to see her without blame, where the wicked cease from the troubling, and the weary are at rest. Anything as would ease her sorrowful mind, and yet make her think I could ever marry, or 'twas possible that anyone could ever be to me what she was. I should ask you to say that with my prayers for her that was so dear. So Ham is saying, well, I want you to tell her that, I don't want you to tell her that I'm happy, because I couldn't be happy without her. So don't tell her that. But if you could find a way to make her feel better so that she doesn't feel so horrible, and that in the coming life in heaven, we could be together in that way without hurting her feelings, and making her feel better, then try to do that. I pressed his manly hand again, and I told him I would charge myself to do this as well as I could. I thank ye, sir. 'Twas kind of you to meet me. 'Twas kind of you to bear him company down, Master Davy. I understand very well, though my aunt will come to London afore they sail, and they'll unite once more, that I am not like to see him again. I fare to feel sure on't. We don't say so, but so 'twill be, and better so. The last you see on him, the very last, will you give him the lovingest duty and thanks of the orphan, as he was ever more than a father to. So Ham is saying, I know that when you go back to London, Mr. Peggotty will go with you, and I'll never see him again. And he hasn't told me that, but I know that's what's going to happen. So he can't break that. He can't break that illusion. So he's saying, when the day comes and they finally leave for Australia, please give him the most sincere goodbye from me, and tell him how grateful I am to him. This I also promised faithfully. I thank ye again, sir, he said, heartily shaking hands. I know where you're a-going. Goodbye. With a slight wave of his hand, as though to explain to me that he could not enter that old place, he turned away. As I looked after his figure, crossing the waste in the moonlight, I saw him turn his face towards a strip of silvery light upon the sea, and pass on looking at it until he was a shadow in the distance. The door of the boathouse stood open when I approached it, and on entering I found it emptied of all its furniture, saving one of the old lockers on which Mrs. Gummidge, with a basket on her knee, was seated looking at Mr. Peggotty. He leaned his elbow on the rough chimney-piece and gazed upon a few expiring embers in the grate, but he raised his head hopefully on my coming in, and spoke in a cheery manner. Come according to promise to bid farewell to it, I guess. Come according to promise to bid farewell to it, Master Davy, he said, taking up the candle. Bare enough now, ain't it? Bare means like nothing. There's nothing there. So if you're not wearing any clothes, you're bare. Bare means you don't have anything. So now he's saying, look around the boat. There's nothing here. Everything's gone. Bare, ain't it? Nothing here. Empty. Bare is like empty. Indeed, you have made good use of the time, said I. Why, we have not been idle, sir. Mrs. Gummidge has worked like a... I don't know what Mrs. Gummidge ain't worked like, said Mr. Peggotty, looking at her at a loss for a sufficiently approving smile. I think, there's an expression to work like a horse, which means to work very hard. And I think he was going to say Mrs. Gummidge is working like a horse, but he stopped and he didn't say it because that would be pretty insulting to say to her face that she's a horse. Mrs. Gummidge, leaning on her basket, made no observation. There's the very locker you used to sit on, long with Emily, said Mr. Peggotty in a whisper. I'm a-going to carry it away with me, last of all. And here's your old little bedroom, see, Master Davy? Almost as bleak tonight as art could wish. In truth, The wind, though it was low, had a solemn sound and crept around the deserted house with a whispered wailing that was very mournful. Everything was gone, down to the little mirror with the oyster shell frame. I thought of myself lying here when that first great change was being wrought at home. I thought of the blue-eyed child who had enchanted me. I thought of Steerforth, and a foolish, fearful fancy came upon me of his being near at hand, and liable to be met at any turn. "'Tis like to be long," said Mr. Peggotty in a low voice, "afore the boat finds new tenants." A tenant is the resident of a place. If you pay rent somewhere, you're a tenant. So he's saying we'll be able to rent this very quickly, very easily. They look upon it down beer as being unfortunate now. Oh, maybe he's saying it won't be rented very easily. Because people think it's ridiculous, maybe, or they think it's bad. I think it's cool. It's an old ship that was wrecked on the beach, and they turned it into a house. I would like to live in that boat. "Does it belong to anybody in the neighborhood?" I asked. "To a mast maker uptown," said Mr. Peggotty. "I'm a-going to give the key to him tonight." We looked into the other room and came back to Mrs. Gummidge sitting on her locker, whom Mr. Peggotty, putting the light in the chimney-piece, requested to rise that he might carry it outside the door before extinguishing the candle. "Daniel," said Mrs. Gummidge, suddenly deserting her basket and clinging as holding something very tight, and clinging to his arm, "my dear Daniel, the parting words I speak in this house is, I mustn't be left behind. Don't you think of leaving me behind, Daniel. Oh, don't you ever do it." So Mr. Peggotty originally thought, oh, Mrs. Gummidge, she doesn't want to go to Australia. She can't, she's an old woman. She can't be on that boat. She can't live in the wild outback of Australia with them. She's better here. And he made sure that she was taken care of. He set up an account where each month she would get some money so she would never starve or be homeless. But she can't be alone. Mr. Peggotty, taken aback. When you're taken aback, you're surprised. That's taken aback. So he wasn't expecting that. He thought for sure she wouldn't want to go on this long trip. Taken aback. Mr. Peggotty, taken aback, looked from Mrs. Gummidge to me, and from me to Mrs. Gummidge, as if he had been awakened from a sleep. Don't ye, dearest Daniel, don't ye," cried Mrs. Gummidge fervently. "Take me along with you. Daniel, take me along with you, and Emily, I'll be your servant, constant and true. If there's slaves in them parts where you're going, I'll be bound to you for one. And happy, but don't ye leave me behind, Daniel. That's a dreary dear." "My good soul," said Mr. Peggotty, shaking his head. "You don't know what a long voyage and what a hard life it is." "Yes, I do, Daniel. I can guess," cried Mrs. Gummidge. "But my parting words under this roof is, I shall go into the house and die if I'm not took. I can dig, Daniel. I can work. I can live hard. I can be loving and patient now, more than you think, Daniel, if you'll only try me. I wouldn't touch the allowance now if it was my dying want, Daniel." So she's saying, yeah, I know that you've left me this money, but I wouldn't touch it. I would rather die than touch that money. I won't touch that money. "Daniel, Peggotty, but I'll go down with you and Emily, if you'll only let me to the world's end. I know how it is. I know you think I'm alone and lorn, but dearie love, 'tain't so no more. I ain't sat here so long a-watching and thinking of your trials without some good being done me. Master Davy, speak to him for me. I knows his ways and Emily's, and I knows their sorrows, and I can be a comfort to 'em some odd times. and labor for 'em. Daniel, dearie, Daniel, let me go long with you. And Mrs. Gummidge took his hand and kissed it with a homely pathos and affection and homely rapture of devotion and gratitude that he well deserved. We brought out the locker, extinguished the candle, fastened the door on the outside, and left the old boat close shut up, a dark speck in a cloudy night. Next day, when we were returning to London outside the coach, Mrs. Gummidge and her basket were on the seat behind, and Mrs. Gummidge was happy. All right, well, that was the end of chapter 51 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Hopefully tomorrow night I will read chapter 52, and I hope that you will at around the same time. So I hope that you will come and join me and ask questions and ask about words that you don't understand or phrases that you don't understand, and we'll read it together. So thank you for watching, and I hope that you come back tomorrow when we read chapter 52.